Thank you, Derek, and it's lovely to see you all. Trust you've had a great weekend, and trust you're looking forward to a great week. Just to get us all on the same page, because Thursday can seem an awful long time ago, what I would like you to do, please, and I don't mind you looking at your notes, but really briefly, in pairs, I would like you to share the biggest thing God has said to you personally through these lectures on David so far. We've had 6 so far. To remind you what we've had, we had a general introduction where we said that this study would be valuable to those of us who are excited about what happens after you die. And we said that God can be training us now for exciting things He has for us in the hereafter. But we said also that God can be equipping us now for the assignments He has for us on planet Earth. And we looked then at lots of general things about David, when he was around, how old he was, etc., and the kind of battles that he faced. And then we moved on to some theology, which some of you would have enjoyed, and others of you, it may have been right up there with watching grass grow. But we asked the question, what is God choosing people all about? Is it primarily about Him choosing an elect group of people to spend eternity with Him and everybody else is fast-tracked to hell? Or is God choosing people in the Bible primarily about Him choosing people for an assignment on the planet? And I gave you the 2 views and I explained my view, although you're perfectly at liberty to throw it away. And then we looked at how God choosing you has everything to do with His sovereignty, but it also has everything to do with your suitability. And I think it's a lie that says that God just chooses anybody at random and sticks them in a job and He will somehow compensate for their inability. Do you remember we said that God's will is downloaded in our DNA? We didn't say this in the lecture, but John Stott says God is the God of creation as well as the God of redemption. Quite often when He's talking to someone He uses in Scripture, He uses language like, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, etc. Then we moved on to how do we recognize God's will in our own life? And I gave you 4 forgotten parameters of guidance. And maybe you can just think of how many of those you can remember. And then last time we were looking at 1 Samuel chapter 17, probably the longest chapter in the whole Bible, about David taking out Goliath. And he wasn't taking him out for a skinny decaf latte, he was taking him out permanently. And we explored some of the pressures that will come upon somebody who wants to be a key player. And we kind of part way through those, and we're going to take them up in a minute. So, out of all that lot, what I'd like you to do is just share in pairs very quickly the single biggest thing that's spoken to me so far is. Okay, I'll give you a couple of minutes for that. Okay, everybody. So, just putting up on the screen what we looked at last Thursday, the problems facing a key player. We talked about the overwhelming problems that David was facing, and then we kind of linked the principles to our own lives. And then we ended last time by looking at some of the undermining pressures. Undermining is a term that can be used with reference to buildings. And here you have a brilliant building. And there's a number of ways of bringing the building down. But one of the ways is to kind of dig away, chip away underneath at the foundation. And we saw two pressures that were chipping away at David's belief that he could do anything in this situation. First of all, ridicule from the enemy. And we're going to look later on this morning at how the enemy targeted, quite literally, David. And then secondly, we looked at discouragement from an older believer. Here is Saul, the king of Israel, who's supposed to be breeding faith and optimism into God's people, and all he does is echo the message that Goliath is going to give to David in a few minutes. You can't take him on. He's a fighting man from his youth. You're just a boy. Hey, just get real, man. And I suggested that if we are involved in church life, that's an experience we will have if we want to be key players. Here's the final one. We didn't look at this last week, so this is now new. Criticism from a brother. Do you remember when David goes down to the, in inverted commas, battle, and he hears Goliath mouthing off? And he's looking around and thinking, why doesn't somebody do something about this? And then he hears the soldiers saying how Saul will reward any soldier who kills Goliath. And we listed the three things that Saul has promised. He's promised his elder daughter's hand in marriage. He's promised a great deal of money to the man who kills Goliath. And he's also said that your family will be exempt. Your heritage, your descendants will be exempt from taxes in Israel. And David is just saying, run that by me again, tell me what he said, when his brother chips in. Please look at 1 Samuel 17 and verse 28. 1 Samuel 17, 28. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You only came down to watch the battle. There are so many missiles being hurled at David in that little speech that his oldest brother makes to him. You know, I don't know if you've ever experienced that words can really, really, really wound you. Somebody can say something, it can be a off-the-cuff remark, or it can be something they've planned to say, and if they hit you in the stomach with a fist, it wouldn't have more impact upon you than the words that they say. Listen to what's hidden in what Eliab says to David. You're useless. With who did you leave those few sheep? You're not doing anything significant with your life. You're just wandering around after a bunch of scruffy sheep, and there aren't very many of those. Look at what he says. With whom did you leave those few sheep? The impression is you have just abandoned them. We can never trust you for anything. We give you a job to do, and you never even finish it. A complete lie, but that's what he says. And then he accuses David of being conceited. I know how conceited you are. You're a big-headed little character, always dreaming dreams and thinking God's got something for you to do. Hey, grow up, kid. And then he says, I know how wicked your heart is. The exact opposite of what God says about David. I found a man after my own heart. You only came down to watch the battle. Could I encourage you to be really careful what you say to other people? Because our words can be carrying the message of the enemy into other people's hearts. It's very interesting, and we've looked at this before, but not at the principle we're going to look at now. It's very interesting to think about the book of Job. As we've said before, the book of Job begins backstage. It begins in the heavenly realm, in that dimension that we are normally completely unaware of. And it talks about a dialogue between the Lord and Satan. You know, put that in your pipe and smoke it. Hello? A dialogue between the Lord and Satan. Oh, God can't even stand to look upon sin. Pardon? Hello? I thought Jesus walked around the streets of Jerusalem and the lanes of Galilee. I thought Jesus, who was God, was the friend of sinners. That doesn't mean he approved of what they were doing, but he was their friend. Satan comes into the presence of God, and he isn't annihilated or vaporized. God and Satan have a conversation. And you know what the conversation's about? It's about Job. The Lord's saying, hey, have you seen Job? And then Satan comes back, well, he only serves you because you look after him. He's not what you think he is. And this dialogue is going on in the presence of the Lord, between the Lord and Satan. In the New Testament, it warns us about the accusations of Satan. It says that Satan accuses, he's the accuser of the brethren. Question, how did the accusations of Satan against Job in the presence of the Lord? So Job isn't involved in this. This is Satan accusing Job to God. He's Satan, the accuser of the brethren. How did those accusations land in Job's own experience? Don't miss this. They landed through the help, the counsel of his three religious friends. His friends who are coming along when life is terrible for him. You check out the sort of stuff they say to Job. It's exactly the stuff that Satan said about Job. They're saying, you're pretending to be a great guy, but obviously rotten things don't happen to good people. Pardon, let's clear that past. Rotten things don't happen to good people, do they? So there is obviously hidden sin in your life, Job. We've always suspected this. And here they are, without realizing it, carrying the accusations of the enemy into Job's own heart. And sometimes we can give flip little remarks and say things and not realize the horrendous impact we've had on somebody. Can I just suggest something to you? That very often when we start correcting other people, we ourselves are the ones who need correcting. And there are some Christians, and honestly, it's almost as though they feel their divine calling is to sort everybody else out. There are people, quite honestly, who come to me, and whenever I see them coming, I think, hey, Rob, put on the flak jacket. You're about to get kneed in the testicles. Here they come, God's little helpers, who are going to come along and are going to start telling you all the stuff that you're doing wrong. I doubt very much whether they've prayed about it. I doubt very much whether they've agonized before God about how they say it. They just come along and boom, you get it all over you. Very, very often when we start correcting other people, the person who needs correcting is us. And Jesus said something about that, didn't he? You remember? About the speck of sawdust in someone's eye, and there you are sorting it out when there's a ginormous plank in your own eye. I was in a church a while ago and it was not a great day for me. I wasn't feeling very well, etc. And I'd gone anyway, and it was a long drive and all the rest of it. And at the end, this guy comes up to me and I think, here we go. He says, can you take a word of constructive criticism? And I'm going to say this in love, and I'm thinking, here we go. When anybody ever says, I'm sharing this in love, just get ready for it. You're about to get punched in the guts, usually. And he said to me, when you preach, you walk around too much. Oh, thanks for that. I didn't know that. Thank you for that brilliant insight. Now, normally I would not have said anything. And I'm not for one moment trying to justify what I said. But I was just so ticked off with this kind of helpful remark from God's little helpers. And so I said to him something along these lines. I said, do you know how many miles I've driven to get here? Now double that for going home. It's probably a couple of hundred. Do you know how much the Inland Revenue say my vehicle costs me to run? And the Inland Revenue are not known for being wonderfully generous. They say my car costs about 45 pence a mile. So 200 miles, what's that? That's £90. That's how much it's cost me to be here. Do you know how long I've been here? Well, I came last night and I stayed until tonight. That's 24 hours. Do you know what the minimum rate paying somebody is in the United Kingdom? The lowest that you can pay anybody in Britain before you become illegal is now about, I think, £7. So let's 7 times 24, what's that? 114, 28, 168. So let's add that onto the 90 odd quid. So we're now up to around 250. How many hours have I spoken here? Do you know how many hours I put in preparing? Do you know in business you normally put somebody in a hotel? You stuck me in somebody's back room. So let's do the maths. You probably owe me somewhere around 400 quid. And your little mate came up to me, this is what happens in churches often in Britain, at the end of a message or at the end of a meeting or a conference, some guy comes up to you with a little brown paper envelope in their hand. And it's like a drug deal is going down, because they shuffle up to you and kind of shake your hand and smuggle this envelope across. It's like, somebody's passing on barbiturates or something. And you open it, and inside is a £20 note. And you're telling me I walk around too much. Now, I'm not saying I should have said that. I was just ticked off with all of these God's little helpers coming along and telling everybody else what's wrong with them. When if you hold a mirror up, there's stuff 20 times bigger in their own life. People have agendas. And when people come to you, don't assume that everything people say with a kind of a condescending smile on their face is actually from God. It could equally well be from the enemy of your soul. Do you remember what I said last week? Never ask a donkey to critique a racehorse. All right, so now let's move on, having had my little say and rant. Let's move on to a key player facing problems. Now, why we're looking at this is because when you move on from here, you go home or you go on to the next area of your life, if God has been speaking to you and doing stuff in your life while you're here at Capernwray, many of you are going to go away thinking, I want to be significant. I don't mean high profile on a stage, but I want to be significant in the purposes of God. I want to be walking and so as to leave footprints. I want to live so as to be missed. I want to do stuff that matters in my life. And you begin to encounter some of the stuff that we've looked at. Overwhelming problems, undermining pressures. Targeted by the enemy. Discouraged by older believers. Criticized by your brothers. How do we respond to that? Well, let's have a look first of all at what David did not do, which is kind of interesting. He doesn't surrender to the surrounding apathy. Here's one of my wonderful jokes that nobody ever gets. You heard the Latin expression status quo. It was a band in the UK, but status quo. Somebody once said that's Latin for the mess that we're in. And that's kind of an English joke, but nobody ever laughs, so I've stopped using it. Status quo means, just the way things are. Don't rock the boat. And when David goes down to watch the battle, that's what his brother said, you only came down to watch the battle. One of the lovely things about David is he doesn't get into criticism. I mean, he could easily have got into being quite critical himself. He could have said to them, what battle? I don't see any battle going on at all, if you don't mind me saying it. There are a lot of people dressed like soldiers. There are a lot of people shouting the battle cry. That's what it says in 1 Samuel 17:20. David reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. So here are all the trappings of battle, but there's no battle going on. Here are people on a Sunday morning in your church, dressed to kill, looking cool, singing fantastic hymns and songs and all the rest of it about how we're going to take on the world and, you know, we are the hope of the world and all the rest of it. But there's absolutely no engagement with the forces of darkness whatsoever. And David doesn't kind of become nasty and saying, I don't see any battle. He actually just kind of turns away from his brother, says, you know, what's the problem? And then says, go on, run by me one more time what Saul will do for the man who kills Goliath. He doesn't surrender to apathy. I read a while ago something that I found hard to believe, but I've since seen it in a number of different references. Do you know what often happens to soldiers in a battle? Especially when the situation is hopeless. So here are a group of soldiers and they're in a little dugout. Maybe there are 5 or 6 of them, and they've got separated from the rest of their unit, and now the enemy are closing in on them. Do you know what sometimes happens? And you think, well, I can't believe this. I promise you it's true. They fall asleep. There is a phenomena psychologically that's called escape sleep. That sometimes when a situation is so overwhelming that we just don't know how to cope with it, one of the ways we try and cope with it is by falling asleep. So, and this is, I'm not criticizing this at all. I've been there, I get this. But if you struggle with depression, one of the symptoms of depression, or of some depressions, is that you keep falling asleep. And then at night you can't sleep. You go to bed, you fall asleep for about 10 minutes, then you wake up, bing, and you think, oh, it's probably 6 o'clock in the morning. You look, it's 5 to 10 at night. And then you lie there kind of half awake. But then through the day, left to your own devices, you're falling asleep. And it's not because you are physically tired and you actually need sleep. It's because you just can't cope with what's coming at you. And so it's a well-known defense mechanism. Well, it seems to me that God's people here in 1 Samuel 17, they're not snoozing, but in terms of taking on the enemy, they've fallen asleep. Nobody has any intention whatsoever of going within any distance at all of Goliath. And David does not buy into that. Now, when you go back home, one of the things that will be a pressure in you, even if you may not realize it, is don't disturb the status quo. Don't give the idea that anything could change around here. Now, I'm not suggesting you go home and you're conceited and you're telling everybody what to do and, I'm probably going to be the next great thing in this place. Go home and be a servant. We're going to look at that in a moment. But don't just buy into this pretend stuff that's going on. Here's the second thing. He doesn't allow people to press him into their mold. We mentioned this last week, although we didn't explore it, that Saul, when he finally gets around to allowing David to go and fight Goliath, plan A for Saul is, wear my armor. 1 Samuel 17:38. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over his tunic and tried to walk around because he was not used to them. I can't go in these, he said to Saul. I'm not used to them. So he took them off. The Message paraphrase of that, in the Message translation or paraphrase of the Bible, David tried to walk but could hardly budge. David told Saul, I can't even move with all this stuff on. I'm not used to it. Here's the second thing that David doesn't do. You know what often happens in churches, if you have a vision, you have a passion, let's reach the young people around the church building, let's reach the young people in our community. And you come up with something that you have seen work, maybe here at Capernwray, you never saw it before. Or you visited a church back in your own country, another church, and wow, they're doing this and it's fantastic. And you go to the leaders and you suggest that. And basically their idea is, listen, if anything's going to happen around here, it is the way we would be doing it if we ever got around to doing it. You don't come up with anything new. Just keep things the way they are. And if you're going to do it, then you do it our way. One of the good questions to ask is, why? Why are we doing things this way? If you want to, like we said before, be as popular as a hot dog in a synagogue, just start asking, why are we doing it this way? Why do we meet at 9:30 on a Sunday morning? Why? Why do we have a Sunday evening service? And it's interesting, some of the non-answers you'll get. I heard a story of a guy who got married and honeymoon, get back home, and it's the first Sunday at home, and his wife is cooking him his Sunday lunch. And they have a nice kind of joint of meat, and so before she puts it in the oven, she cuts off 3 inches off the end and she puts it on one side. And he sees this but thinks, maybe it was a bit too much fat on that or something, so he doesn't say anything. But the next time they're having Sunday lunch, he sees exactly the same thing happen. So this time he says to her, why did you cut 3 inches off the end? And she said, well, why wouldn't I? And he said, well, I'm not asking you why wouldn't you, I'm asking you why do you? And she said, because my mum always did that. And he said, why? And she said, well, why shouldn't she? He said, no, I'm asking you, why does she? So she said, well, I don't actually know. I just saw her doing that when I was a little girl, so I do it that way. He said, well, let's give her a ring. So they ring up the mum and go through the whole performance and have the same kind of deal. Yes, you're right, I do. Why? Well, why wouldn't I? No, I know, but why do you? Because my mum did. Well, why did she? Well, why shouldn't she? And on around the houses we go. So eventually they ring up the grandmother and say, when you do Sunday lunch, is it true you cut 3 inches off the end of the joint? She said, yeah. Why? She said, because I've only got a small roasting tin. Welcome to the church. Welcome to doing stuff that 60, 70, 80 years ago we had a reason for. But we're still doing it. You know why most churches, for instance, meet at 6 o'clock on a Sunday evening? Why? I'll tell you why. Certainly in Britain anyway, and certainly in the communities around here. It was for the farmers who are, this is the best time for them to come. It also had to do with lighting the building, oil lamps and stuff. Let's come before it's going dark so the service can be finishing just as it's starting to go dark. Hey, newsflash, we've got electricity. Things have changed. David refuses to be jammed into somebody else's way of doing it. Now, this is going to be a big thing for you. This is a big thing for me. Because you see, as you get involved in churches, and especially if you're preaching or leading something, there are expectations placed upon you. This is how we do it around here. This is what we think. This is what we believe around here. And I want to be honest, one of the biggest battles I have when I'm invited to speak somewhere is I usually know the place I'm going to, and I know the theological position of the people who've invited me, and I don't want to offend people. I don't want to be there and trying to sort them out. That's not what I'm talking about at all. But I know sometimes there are passions that I have that I've taken 50 years to arrive at, and I know if I say this, we're not on about some fundamental principle of doctrine, we're on about some tiny little thing off the side. Say this, the balloon's going to go up. And I've had to come to the place of, Lord, I'm going to be me. I'm not going to be rude and insensitive, but nor am I going to dress and talk and use all the language that people expect. A long time ago, I decided I am not going to stand on a platform and give out advice that doesn't work for me. But that advice is the party line. That's what in evangelical churches we say to people. Because, and if you say that, then everybody's, oh, it was really good to have Rob here, blah, 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 blah. You know, some people have the idea the answer to every flipping problem in the cosmos is have a quiet time. That's it. Are you having a quiet time? Doesn't matter what the problem is. Doesn't matter if you've got terminal cancer. Doesn't matter, you know, your wife's left you. Doesn't matter you've no job. Have a quiet time. Well, yeah, have a quiet time, but that is not the answer to everything. But you stand up in loads and loads of churches and say what I just said, and thanks, Rob, we won't be asking you back. They don't say that, but that's the message. Don't allow people to force you into their mold that isn't working for them either. So what does David do? Well, it seems to me that he brings into this mega problem principles he'd learned in smaller problems. He brings into the mega public battle the principles he's learned in smaller private battles. Now you remember when he has the dialogue with Saul about Saul saying you can't go and all the rest of it. You're just a boy. And Saul says, hey, but you know what? I've looked after sheep. And we've been attacked by lions. What? Lions? Bears? And I've taken them on. I mean, in private, he's been doing stuff that is preparing him for this defining moment in his life. Do you remember what we said last week? We said that defining moments do not come pre-announced. They don't come with flashing lights and waving flags and ringing bells and all the rest of it. This is a defining moment in your life. No, it just begins like any other day. This morning when David woke up, 1 Samuel 17, just another day. But it's a day that changes the whole direction of his life. So what are some of the principles that he demonstrates? Well, this isn't goosebump stuff now. This isn't, oh, wow, this is just down-to-earth living. He demonstrates humility and dependability. So how does the day begin? Well, 1 Samuel 17, verse 12. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was old and well advanced in years. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. So, simple maths, if there are 8 sons, and the 3 oldest have gone off to battle, how many does that leave at home? That leaves 5 at home. And so Jesse comes to David and says, we've bought these pizzas, we've got these supplies, could you take them down to your brothers at the battlefield? And David does not say, why should I have to do it? Yeah, I've got enough to do without traipsing off down there. Does this kind of dialogue go down in your house? There's a half-drunk cup of tea or coffee on the sideboard, and your mum says, could you just put that in the kitchen? It's not my cup. I didn't leave it there. Why am I supposed to move it? It's Maureen, it's not me. Tell her. Hey, welcome to people who are not key players. On this day, the whole day begins by David being asked to do something. Now, I'm sure he wanted to do it, actually, to get near the battle. But he's asked to do something that is, kind of not that important, actually. Do you remember what we said? Mother Teresa once said, we cannot do great things for God, but we can do many small things done with great love. Then David is prepared to be a nobody. Just a servant. This is what I said we were going to look at a few minutes ago. David is not conceited. He's not arrogant. He's not rude when he talks to Saul. And this is kind of a delicate balance, isn't it? It's possible to just roll over and do everything everybody wants you to do, even though it's a complete waste of time, in terms of, well, this is how we would do it if we were doing it, but we've no intention of. But hey, but you got to do it our way. It's easy to be rude in that situation, or it's easy to roll over, but David is neither. 1 Samuel 17:32, David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. David views himself as a servant of King Saul. Or 1 Samuel 17, verse 58. Whose son are you, young man? Saul asked. David said, I'm the son of your servant, Jesse of Bethlehem. So there's a beautiful humility about David. And there's also a great reliability. You give David a job to do, it'll get done very well. So, for instance, with who did you abandon those few sheep, is what his elder brother says. Look at 1 Samuel 17:20. Early in the morning. We're probably talking 4:35 a.m. David left the flock with a shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp just as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. He left somebody, made sure somebody looked after the sheep. He didn't just think, hey, the battle, here we go, da-da-da-da-da. Whoops, forgot the sheep. What happens when he arrives at the battle? He hears them shouting the war cry. David left the things he had brought with the keeper of supplies and ran to the battle lines. It's so easy when something exciting comes along to think, oh, just abandon what I'm doing and leave it and it'll get sorted out somehow. This is David. There's humility, there is reliability built into the guy. I'm sure some of you have heard this before. It's talking about a number of people. Here are their names. Their names are anybody, nobody, everybody, and somebody. One day there was a job that needed doing. Anybody could have done it. Nobody realized that everybody wouldn't do it. Everybody said that somebody should do something, but nobody realized that everybody would do nothing. As a result, a job that could have been done by anybody was left to everybody, so nobody did what somebody should have done. Hey, how about going home to your church and saying, what are the things that you need doing here that nobody else will do? And they might come out with, well, if you could clean the toilets, that'd be great. We're having a problem, the caretaker's poorly, and it'd be great if you could just clean the toilets. Are you serious? Yeah. David's defining moment came on a day when he was doing something that wasn't that removed from cleaning the toilets, doing something that needed doing, but nobody else seemed to want to do it. Let me read you something, and I debated long and hard whether I should read you this. I asked my daughter, Abby, and she said, Dad, do not read it early on in the term, or you will have 160 student-shaped holes in the walls of the building. She said, wait until they know you and think you're kind of okay, and then read it to them. All right? So this is pretty challenging, I'm telling you. This is Bill Gates speaking at a high school, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, in Visalia, California. And it's when people are graduating. And he talks about how feel-good, politically correct teachings have created a generation of kids with no concept of reality, and how this concept set them up for failure in the real world. I had lunch on Friday with that guy I've told you about before, the sumo man, the shut up and move on guy, who speaks all over the world. And he was running by me a whole bunch. He does a lot of work in schools. And he says, some of the statements now that educators are coming out with, prepare the road for the students. What a load of rubbish. How about preparing the students for the road? How about preparing people for what real life's like? So this is what Bill Gates said. Rule 1, life isn't fair, you better get used to it. Rule 2, the world couldn't care less about your self-esteem. The world will expect you to accomplish something before you feel good about yourself. Rule 3, you'll not make $40,000 a year right out of high school. You won't be a vice president with a car phone until you earn both. Rule 4, if you think your teacher is tough, wait till you get a boss. Rule 5, flipping burgers is not beneath your dignity. Your grandparents had a different word for burger flipping. They called it an opportunity. Rule 6, if you mess up, it's not your parents' fault. So don't whine about your mistakes, learn from them. Rule 7, before you were born, your parents weren't as boring as they are now. They got that way from paying your bills, cleaning your clothes, and listening to you talk about how cool you are. So before you save the rainforest from the parasites of your parents' generation, try delousing the closet in your own room. Rule 8, your school may have done away with winners and losers, but life hasn't. In some schools, they have abolished failing grades, and they'll give you as many times as you want to get the right answer. This doesn't bear the slightest resemblance to anything in real life. Rule 9, life isn't divided into semesters. You don't get summers off, and very few employers are interested in helping you find yourself. Do that in your own time. Rule 10, television is not real life. In real life, people actually have to leave the coffee shop and go out to work. Rule 11, be nice to nerds. The chances are you'll find yourself working for one. Woo! I'm sure that went down really well. All right. I already put that down so we can skim past that. Last couple of minutes. We've also looked at that. And then David has a strategy for what he's doing. We looked at this last week, so I'm not going to revisit it. But all his life he's been using this sling. Do you remember we said these eastern shepherds could hit a reed at 20 meters? And David brings onto this big event stuff that he's been doing in the background for years. And finally, his security in the Lord. Again and again and again, and I've not mentioned this simply because you've heard loads of sermons on it. He's trusting God. Let me just tell you 2 stories about athletics and then we're through. I know that the lovely devotional that you had, 10 to 9 until 9, was looking at this. And she did a great job. I was listening. It was well done. And she's talking about an athlete in training. Until fairly recently, excuse me, the guy who had the most medals for swimming, I know now it's Michael Phelps, but it was a guy called Mark Spitz. And he won 7 golds at one Olympics swimming for America. And he was being interviewed, and here's what he said about his training program. He said, in training for these Olympics, I swam the equivalent of twice around the world. I got up early in the morning, and I was down at the local pool, swimming up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down. Years ago on British television, we used to have a program, and it was called Superstars, and they would get athletes from different disciplines, and they would all compete against each other in a whole raft of challenges. And you weren't allowed to be involved in any challenge that was connected to your particular sport or area of athletics. So, for instance, if they had taking penalty kicks, if you're a professional footballer, then you couldn't be part of that. And I remember watching the final of European Superstars. And it was from the winner from each of these European countries now came together to find the guy who was the best in Europe. And coming up to the final event, they had two athletes. They had a man called David Hemry, who was English, who jumped the hurdles for England. And then they had an Austrian guy, I've forgotten his name, really, really tough-looking guy. And they were absolutely equal on points coming up to the last event. And the last event was running twice around this track, but just a couple of places there were hurdles. And there was a water jump, a hurdle with a little trough filled with water on the other side, right before the final straight. And because David Hemry was a hurdler, but he had to enter this final event because the two of them were equal points, they set him off half a lap behind everybody else. And it's a 2-lap race. And we're now coming up to the finishing straight, and he's absolutely equal with this Austrian guy in the front, and they're running. And Hemry goes over the hurdle, he trips, falls headlong in the water jump, comes out of the water and runs down the finishing straight, and he's second. He doesn't win, but he runs, and then he collapses. And it shows you his coach running over to him, and they're rolling his sock down, and his ankles ballooning. And then it shows you the fall. And they've slowed it down, and you can see him coming up to the hurdle, really straining. And it shows him going over and catching his foot and falling. And as he falls in the water and starts to come out of the water, they freeze frame it. And on his face are two things. There is absolute agony as he realizes what he's done to his ankle, and there is complete determination to keep running. Now, that determination to keep running did not come because there were probably hundreds of thousands of people watching all around Europe on the TVs. The determination to keep going in the big event was because week after week, after month, after year, at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning before he went off to work, he's climbing out of bed and running round and round and round and round and round a boring running track. If we want to be a key player, there's no shortcut. And what we do in the small events of life is either equipping or disqualifying us to be a key player in the kingdom. All right, I went on 5 minutes. Please forgive me for that. But I know now you've got a 10-minute break. So back at 10 o'clock, and Derek reminded you to bring stuff down because it's not a prayer time. It was going to be Bible reading or whatever. So, okay? God bless you.